mine that I pulled out yesterday. And just water. I bet it is. Those treadmills were for one that was broken yesterday. So I was in this one. Stopped. Each other. Stop. Just like real slowly slow down. Alright, well, I guess that's it. Man, who knows what happened? Yesterday, the middle one, the one on the right, was, they said like the motor was bad or something, so only the one on the left, which I was able to use, worked. So I wonder if they came in and did something to like to try to fix it that blew the electrical circuits or something. Yeah. So, awesome. I was on the one on the right. Yeah, and there was like a guy on the bike, so. Short distance. So this one came out. do like a bunch of sit-ups.
All rise. This court is back in session.
No, I can see everyone. We'll dispense with that. Good morning, everyone. All counsel are present. Please have a seat. I hope you all had a good evening. And we are ready with our next witness.
Your Honor, we're going to call Mark Talent.
Okay. I hope that sleep for our out-of-town guests was a little less raucous last night since we didn't have a heat celebration downtown. Good morning. If you would please remain standing until you're sworn. Okay. If you would kindly state your full name and slowly spell it. It helps my court reporter and also gives you an opportunity to try out the microphone. The acoustics are challenging, and if you can assist so that the court reporter can hear you and everyone else can hear you, we would appreciate it.
Mark L. Talent, that's Tallent, Jr.
And Mark is M-A-R-K or M-A-R-C?
M-A-R-K.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Ehrlich, you ready? You may proceed, Ms. Mayor.
Good morning, Mr. Talent.
Morning.
Where are you employed?
The Florida Department of Corrections.
And what position do you hold with the Florida Department of Corrections?
I'm the Director of Budget and Finance.
And how long have you held that position?
The Director of Budget for 8 years. I picked up the finance in the last 2 years.
What is the Department of Corrections annual budget?
Operating budget is a little less than $2 million. If you add in the trust funds, it's about 2.1 billion. Billion, not million, excuse me.
What do you mean if you add in the trust funds?
We have a general revenue fund, the tax money, and we have trust funds, which gives us authority. We have to have the cash to support the authority, so we would apply for federal grants or donations or stuff like that. So we have authority. If we don't have the cash to support it, we can't spend it. So if we don't have a federal grant,
Okay.
then the authority just sits there. You have to have cash to spend it.
Matching funds. It's
Matching stuff like
Okay.
that, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And Mr. Talent, the trust fund is one where you can collect funds under the authority given you by statute?
That is correct.
And if you don't collect the funds, there's no money to spend.
That is correct.
What was the annual budget for 2012-2013?
A little less than 2.1 billion.
And what about the budget for 2013-2014?
A little more than 2.1 billion.
Okay. Does the state of Florida require a balanced budget?
Yes, ma'am.
And what does that mean?
It means the legislature, when they meet in session and pass a budget, they cannot appropriate more money than is received or collected by the state.
And can you spend more money than what you're given in your budget?
You're not supposed to.
Okay. Is it required that you try to make ends meet by the end of the budget year?
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Could you briefly explain the budget process in Florida?
The budget process in Florida, on October 15th of every year, the department's agencies are required to submit what we call a legislative budget request. We submit this electronically, and it's basically what the department feels its needs are. Base budget, your beginning budget, plus your additional needs for the next year. In around January, the governor collects all this data, and he submits his recommendation. The legislature takes the governor's recommendation while they're in session, and they pass their budget. The legislature is the budgeting body. We make recommendations and requests. The governor makes recommendations and requests, but the legislature is the final say in what is appropriated. And this happens every year towards the beginning of May.
Do you always get what you ask for?
No, ma'am.
And Florida's fiscal year starts July 1, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Was the department able to operate within its 2012-2013 budget?
No, ma'am.
Did you have a shortfall?
Yes.
And how much was that?
It's projected on June 30th to be $45 million.
Okay, and how was it higher than that earlier than the year?
Yes, as we started session, our projected deficit was $88 million. The legislature did provide what we call back-of-the-bill funding of $43 million. That means when the governor signs the budget, we get current year funding. To help us offset our deficit, we received $43 million, which cut our deficit to $45.
And how is the shortfall handled in your budget?
The biggest way we handle our shortfalls in our budget, because we are a very staff-intensive agency, is we hold vacancies. We put on a hiring freeze. That means we don't hire administrative staff. We make our security staff operate at a higher vacancy rate. We basically generate vacancies to hold salary dollars to be able to transfer that to other areas of the budget.
Are there other mechanisms that you use besides salary budget?
Yes, we probably limit the amount of money we appropriate to each of our institutions for expenses. We would look at contracts. Can we negotiate rates? Can we, if a contract comes up for renewal, is there an escalation clause we might not pick up? We go through a whole series of steps to look for ways to save dollars. We look at our work squads. Do we suspend some work squads for 4, 5, 6 months? But the biggest task for us is salary and benefits.
And what expenses are generally addressed first in your budget?
We cover our fixed costs, which would be utilities, your electric bills. You have to pay your electric bills, especially if you're a prison system, to keep the fences and the lights on. The second step would be your phone bills, salary and benefits. I mean, you pay what you have to pay, what you're required to pay to keep the place up and running, your fixed cost.
And then after that, you try to meet the other expenses that you have. And if there's a shortfall, you do the exercises that you just described?
That's correct. We cover our fixed costs. We appropriate what we feel we can live on, and we basically don't do anything. We don't expand any programs. We don't put any additional programs on. We try to do what programs we're funded for, whether it be through federal grants or GR funding. We limit it to those dollars. We don't expand anything.
So there may be department needs that can't be met, correct?
Yes, ma'am. There are a lot of department needs that are not met.
Can you give us some examples?
Our biggest example would really go to our fixed capital outlay. And our fixed capital outlay is...
Can you do me one small favor? Just slow down a bit. When my court reporter's head goes down like that, he's into his Harley-Davidson motorcycle mode.
Yes, ma'am.
And so just a nanosecond slower. You're very familiar with this. I'm sure you've testified before.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Just have pity on my court reporter.
I will do that.
Thank you. Not that he needs pity, but I like to continue to work with him.
Okay.
And his wife will not be happy if he dies under my auspices.
One of the biggest areas we suffer in is what we call fixed capital outlay, and that's where we request our repair and maintenance budget and to maintain our facilities. We go through an exercise, and it goes back to the legislative budget request, where we would submit things to our regions, which we have 3 regions throughout the state: a southern, middle, and northern region. When we send it to our regional maintenance staff, we ask, what are your needs for the upcoming fiscal year? We generally get back requests from them that total $78 to $100 million in needs. And that would be to repair fences, roofs. Do we need to upgrade any of our buildings, our generators, or just big ticket maintenance items? When we build our LBR request, we know if we...
Excuse me, what's LBR?
Legislative budget request.
You've just finished your legislative session, correct?
Correct.
And you survived.
Barely.
Oh, but it was much better this year than it has been in the past several years, correct?
Yes, ma'am. As we build our legislative budget request. We've take this $100 million and we try to whittle it down to what are the most pressing needs. We submitted our legislative budget request. It included $12 million for repair and maintenance items.
Was that for this coming year? This
would be for fiscal year 13-14. As we moved through the process and we got our final budget, this $100 million, where we requested 12, we were actually appropriated 1.2. The $1.2 million will go to one project at Baker Correctional Institution. So we have a lot of unmet needs. We don't submit the full $100 million because we can't spend $100 million in repair projects. We just don't have the staff or time. So we try to prioritize our request, and that's where the $12 million come in. But we have a lot of unmet needs because we got $1.2 million. So that means I have to take $3 million out of expenses to try to set aside for routine maintenance items, things that are going to arise. Like a couple months ago, we had a roof at Jefferson start to collapse. We have to take all the inmates out, relocate them, find funding to fix this roof so we can move them back. So we have needs. Hurricane season's coming. It's just fixed capital outlay is a very big unmet need for the department.
So every year you look for ways to address those unmet needs and other unmet needs that you may have in the budget.
Yes, ma'am. We have to maintain a certain amount of capacity so we do not trigger early release in this state. So repair and maintenance is a very big need for the Department of Corrections.
I'm sorry. Trigger early release? Tell me about that.
If our population gets to within 99% of our bed capacity, it triggers. We don't want to get into overcrowding. So it would trigger an early release. We're at 92, 93%. We're not even close. But if a hurricane comes through, God forbid, and tears up a couple prisons, then we're getting closer to that. And we have a couple facilities that we keep on ready. So the state is very prepared not to trigger this, but it is always in the back of our minds as a possibility. That's why repair and maintenance is such a high profile need for us.
And is the early release set by statute? Is the early release trigger set by statute?
Yes, ma'am.
When was the last budget of the department that was not faced with some sort of shortfall going into the new budget year?
I've been the budget director for 8 years, and in my full 8 years, it's been a struggle. The last 2 to 3 years have obviously been very bad. We've not been able to live within our appropriations, but the previous 5 years, through some of the means we discussed earlier with the hiring freezes and everything like that, we've been able to get very close. We could cover our payables. We could cover our goods that were received prior to June 30th, but some of the things that were ordered prior to June 30th and we didn't receive till after July 1st generally came out of the next year budget. So the last 8 years has really been a struggle.
And in particular, the last 3 years have had significant shortfalls?
Yes, ma'am. The last 3 years. In fiscal year 10-11, we went to a complete hiring freeze. That means we did not hire staff at all from February forward to help us get down to the zero level. Excuse me. In 11-12, we carried forward $36.1 million. That means we had expenditures we could not cover to the tune of $36.1 million that rolled into
30 billion or million?
Million.
Okay, just slow down, because remember, I have to absorb all of this.
Okay.
And he has to make sure that he gets it down accurately. So if you can help the two of us, it will help your counsel very much.
All right.
Make sure that we make a record and everybody does their job.
Okay. It was $36.1 million that we carried forward from 11-12 into 12-13. This year, as we discussed earlier, the projected carry forward going forward into next year is carry forward deficit of $45 million that will move into 13-14.
So for the past 5 years, what is the deficit that you've been carrying forward each year?
The first year that we carried forward anything that we really tracked of any significance would have been 11-12, which was the $36.1 million. The previous years, we would have just carried forward the encumbrances, orders that had not been received yet. I don't have a dollar figure for that. The dollar figures I have would have been 11-12, which is the 36.1 and the 45 projected this year.
Okay, and what made you decide to shift the accounting practices so that you now have a deficit, a carry forward deficit figure?
I don't know that we would really consider it shift the accounting practices. What happened in fiscal year 11-12, our budget was reduced for privatization. There was a proposal before the legislature to privatize the prisons in South Florida. They reduced our budget based on this exercise. I don't know if you're aware or not, but the privatization of prisons in South Florida did not move forward. Our budget did not get restored until this year. As of May, they put the funding back in our budget. So we had that exercise. The CJEC, which is the criminal, CJEC, which stands for Criminal Justice Estimating Conference. And that's how the department's budget is funded. We're based on our population. The CJEC estimates have not been as accurate as they should be. So we have a higher population than we're funded for. So we were short another $10.8 million that we should have had that we didn't. So these type of things, legislative mandates or projections that are supposed to happen and don't happen, but our budget is affected by them, is kind of what caused the $36.1 million. We had a appropriation we were supposed to have, but we didn't, and now it's kind of dovetailed. It's increased. So.
Can you recall when you were first asked to start budget planning for the expansion of the South Florida Reception Center pilot project for kosher meals?
The first recollection I have to this pilot program would have been towards the end of the Secretary McNeil administration, which was 2010-11 fiscal year, so probably maybe November 10 through about February 11, and then when Secretary Buss replaced Secretary Meal, the discussions continued. So late 10, early 11.
During those discussions, was the budget deficit a key consideration in whether to expand?
Yes, ma'am. When Secretary Buss took over, he implemented a hard hiring freeze right when he took over in February 11, because we were projecting, I don't remember the exact figure, but a significant shortfall in the 10-11 year. The hiring freeze allowed us to get very close to living within our appropriation. So he implemented a very drastic measure, because a hiring freeze a lot of times we will not do with security staff just because of the nature of our business. He implemented a hard hiring freeze statewide.
So during 2010, 2011, all other projects were put on hold in order to address the deficit?
Yes, ma'am. As soon as Secretary Buss started, it basically all hands on deck were to eliminate our deficit for that fiscal year.
When you're doing your budget cutting exercises or trying to balance your budget through some sort of cost-saving measures, is the dollar amount what is critical to you, or some percentage of a line item?
I do not factor in percentages when we look at this at all. Everything we do is dollar related. What is the deficit, the dollar value of the deficit? What are the dollar values I can get from certain areas to eliminate that deficit?
Help me, you are much more knowledgeable about the budgeting process, but just so that I have a rudimentary understanding. You start with a per inmate cost to determine what you expect your operating costs to be? Or, I mean, how do you...
We will start...
What's the major driving factor in putting together your budget?
Right. As we've moved through the years, basically, as we moved into 13-14, we started with a base budget. That would be basically our 11-12 budget coming forward. And that would be recurring dollars. We have two types of dollars in the state. We have recurring and non-recurring. Recurring carries forward year after year after year after year. So as our population increased, we received funding through the years. So our base budget has increased through the years. Sometimes the state of Florida does not have recurring dollars available. So they may say we need to fund something with non-recurring dollars, which is 1 year. Starts July 1st. On June 30th, that funding goes away. So in your legislative budget request, you have to be prepared to request to have the non-recurring shifted back to recurring, or request non-recurring funding for it again for another year, so you don't lose the funding. And then you have the Criminal Justice Estimating Conference, which meets twice a year, and they project the population going forward basically for the next 5 years. For the next year's funding, if your population is going to increase, we have this big convoluted spreadsheet that we plug these numbers into. But our additional population funding is we're going to get funding for staffing, which would be dorm officers. We don't need support staff around the prison. We need dorm officers because we'll have to open another dorm. So we'll get dorm staffing. We get classification, which would be the positions that work with the inmates. Classify them, work them through the system, get them in the programs if they're available, stuff like that. So that's the only two type of positions we'll get with the estimating conference. We get their expense funding, which is additional food, bedding, clothing, just subsistence type supplies. And then we'll get health care funding. We'll get a portion of our health care funding, whether it be a little bit of an increase in our drug budget or our inmate health care budget. Those are the things that are funded through CJIC. And then everything else is basically what the department feels. What the department feels they need. And one of our requests this year is we requested additional funding for staffing. So we wouldn't have to go into as many hiring freezes and everything like that. Let us fill some more positions. We're burning our staff out. We need to hire people. So we asked for funding for that. We asked for our repair and maintenance budget, which we discussed a little bit earlier. We may request money for vehicles. We lost a federal substance abuse grant. We requested general revenue dollars so we wouldn't have to cut the programs. So that's, you have a base, you have a population, and then you have a request. And then it's up to the legislature basically to fund it. In the previous couple years, we were also required to submit a reduction exercise. If you're going to cut us, here's where we want you to cut us, type thing. We didn't have to do that this year. Like you said, it was a much better year. Did we get everything we asked for? No, but it was definitely an improvement. But that's kind of the process.
And what has there been an inmate population increase in 2010 to 2011, 2011, and 2012?
The actual population, CJIC has adjusted their populations down the last 3 years. Population is hovering right around 100,000 inmates, between 100,000 and 101. It's been that way for the last couple months. The CJIC projections, if you go back 3 or 4 years, I mean, they had us booming to 110, 115,000 inmates. Right now, I think today the inmate population was 100,200 and some. We're about 470 above what CJIC projected. So it's getting a lot closer, but we're still over what we're funded for.
Okay.
What flexibility does the department have in moving its funds around within the budget?
We have three three options available to us. We can submit budget amendments. We can submit what we call a 5% transfer. A 5% transfer is basically you can move 5% of a line item or $250,000, whichever's greater. And this generally can cross program areas and cross categories. So we could move 5% of a salary appropriation down to expense if we needed to. We have what we call a 5-day budget amendment. It's a little more restrictive. You can't cross program lines, and it's limited in statute by what you can do within a category. In our budget, say the security and institutional operations budget, we have 8 budget entities. We have adult male, female, different custody types. We can move money between each of those salary categories, but we can't take it from one of them and move it over to health care. So we're limited there, but we can move bigger amounts of money. It's just limited where we can put them. And the last is the Legislative Budget Commission, which is a House, Senate membership. It's a commission. We submit an amendment. It's where we can pretty much do anything. It just requires their approval. And those are our three options.
So essentially, you have some ability to rob Peter to pay Paul in your budget.
We rob Peter to pay Paul all the time in our budget. Yes, ma'am.
Sounds like a standard agency.
And when does the department actually get its funds advanced for its budget?
Quarterly. We get a quarterly release. When we start in July, about the first week in July, it's generally around July 7th because they like to kind of close out the books from the previous year. We'll get a quarter's release in July. Quarter's release towards the end of September, end of December, end of March.
So you have also a cash flow type of challenge during the budget year?
We have a significant cash flow problem in our agency. What we do is a lot of times we'll have to move expenditures, park them, move them from one category to another category just to be able to pay bills until we get the next release. So yes, we have a significant cash flow problem.
And if you don't pay your bills on time, is there a consequence?
There is a penalty. DFS, it's an interest penalty. Luckily, through maneuvering of our funds, we do a pretty good job of limiting that. I will say at the end of session, we were holding bills. We had to hold them up to about 7 to 8 days, waiting for the governor to sign the budget, so we got the additional $43 million. Luckily, he signed 5 days early, so we did not trigger the interest, but yes, we were holding bills.
Are there certain budget categories that simply cannot be touched in your budget?
Historically, private prisons. Private prisons are maintained by another agency. They do the contracting. We pay the bill. That's a category we don't try not to touch. If there's funding available at the end of the year.
I don't understand. A different agency takes care of what?
The Department of Management Services issues and maintains the contracts for the private prisons. Management Services, DMS, holds the contracts for our private prisons. They issue the bids, they do the negotiation, they maintain the contracts.
But how does that affect the Department of Corrections?
We'll do security audits. We'll have partnerships, agreements with the private prisons. We simply pay the bill. The appropriation is given to us to pay the bill.
Okay. I thought you just said that privatization did not go forward. I recognize there are some private facilities in the state correctional system. Is that what you're referring to, the existing ones? Okay.
These are the existing 7.
And what percentage of the budget is in the privatized corrections institution? What I'm trying to do is getting a feel for the budget and all of the stuff that you're talking about.
A rough guess, it's $150 to $200 million sits in this category to pay these bills. So 8 to 10% would be my guess is tied to
And
private prisons.
how many institutions are of your, is it 68?
64, I believe.
64
was the testimony,
institutions?
Your Honor.
There are 7 private institutions and roughly 10,000 inmates, 10% of the population.
And that's costing the state $200 million?
Probably closer to the 160 to 170 range. I just don't have the exact number in my head.
So privatization doesn't sound like it's saving the state much money.
The current way the department works through the comparisons is it's based on a comparable facility, not a department per diem as a whole. So you're comparing one private facility to one state facility. And if the private facility has to be 7% less than the state facility you've selected to compare it to. So you're not looking at an overall per diem. You're looking at a one-on-one comparison. So the way the current contracts are negotiated and the comparables used on the current contracts, it is a savings.
Okay.
Are there also line items in the budget that you typically would not touch to make up for other, shortfalls?
I guess, ma'am, and the two that really come to mind would be our People First system, which is human resources. It's the department's timekeeping, not departments, but states' timekeeping, time management type system, People First. We are appropriating funds for that. We are unable to touch that category. And our insurance, risk management insurance. We pay a lot of money in insurance. We have a lot of buildings. We're unable to touch that funding also. Those would be the two biggest.
So in your overall approximately $2 million budget, not all of that is available to you to move around?
That is correct.
What is the department's current food budget?
Approximately $50 million.
Is that figure an increase or a decrease over prior years?
In fiscal year 11-12, we took a $5.3 million reduction in our food budget. Uh,
Are there ways that the department tries to reduce costs in its food budget?
They look at, they follow a weekly pricing. Can they substitute a product? You know, so they follow the prices of commodities. Boy.
Do you grow any of your food?
There's a good one. Yes, we have a very significant farming program. I'm at a loss, but we do have a big farming program.
I can identify with senior moments. So,
Okay.
is that what you're having?
Ma'am, I didn't hear you.
You're having a senior moment?
Oh, definitely. It's been a long day.
What about pricing changes? Do you look for those?
Yeah, they follow the pricing changes. Like I tried to explain, maybe I didn't do it properly, weekly. Commodities, food prices go up and down, and they try to pick the prices that are at the lowest cost during the time they're looking. So yes, they do pricing.
Is some of that constrained by your contract with a food supplier?
I really don't know that I would be able to answer that. I'm sorry.
Is there any excess in the department's food budget?
No, ma'am. Actually, as part of the back of the bill, the $43 million the legislature gave us this year to help offset our deficit, we put about $1.5 million into the food budget to help get it closer to zero, but we're still probably going to be maybe a couple $100,000 short. We have two months to go. Maybe we'll get there, but right now we put an additional funding in, and we're a couple $100,000 short.
Does that mean that any costs associated with implementing the department's expanded religious diet program will have to come from other sources?
Yes, ma'am. We'll have to look at a way to fund it.
Are you familiar with the projected costs associated with implementing the department's proposed or planned current expansion of its religious diet program?
I've seen some rough estimates. I think there's still a lot. Obviously, participation is going to play a big role in it, but I know there's about $500,000 worth of equipment that needs to be purchased. We have some OPS, other personal services temporary staff that we need to hire that's probably going to run us about $1 million. And based on the level of participation, our food costs could obviously go anywhere from zero if no one participates to maybe $15 million if all 7,500 eligible inmates participated. We know that's not going to happen. A conservative estimate is this program will probably maybe $3 to $5 million, I would think, is what we have to come up with.
The budget deficit obviously is going to be a continuing issue for the department and for expanding this kosher diet program. How are you going to see that the program is funded?
Can you rephrase that?
Sure. The department's obviously faced with a budget shortfall this year.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you've been given a directive that you will fund an expanding program.
Yes, ma'am.
How are you going to go about getting the funds to, where will you go in the budget to look for the funding?
I understand. The first thing we're going to look at, and being a high or a very intensive staffing agency, generally if we looked at a correctional officer position, it's about 20 FTE per $1 million. They're paid a little bit.
FTE is full-time equivalents. Thank you.
We have, so you're looking at 20 positions per $1 million. If we were at the low end $3 million, we're looking at 60 positions. If it gets to the high end $5 million, you could be looking at 100 positions. So somewhere between 60 to 100 positions would be my recommendation we need to hold vacant. I would not recommend that in security, just because of the nature of their job. It would fall on administrative staff. Clerical staff, my staffing, if I had a person leave, I would have to hold my position vacant. So it basically boils down to 60 to 100 positions would be held vacant. Or we would create 60 to 100 additional vacancies.
And why does that number, the projected number for the temporary, this is the temporary staff that you anticipate?
This would be the equipment, the OPS, and other personal services, temporary staff. It would be all three. Or am I not understanding your question?
Okay. I'm having trouble understanding your testimony.
Okay.
Just remember, I'm not as familiar with
Yes,
everything that you're saying. So you said that. Let me tell your counsel.
Okay, you want me to?
I'm not clear as
Okay,
to
I'll be happy
his
to.
analysis as to where he's.
I'll be happy to walk him through it for
Okay,
you, Your Honor.
thank you.
I just didn't want to interrupt you if you wanted to ask the question. Okay. I think where we need to start is that there's no money in the food budget right now for the expansion of the kosher diet program, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So sources of funding will have to be found to address those costs, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And what you've been told that you're going to be looking at to get funding for is the equipment,
Correct.
some temporary staff to assist with the implementation, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And then the actual food costs themselves, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And you said that you've been told that about $500,000 is what the possible equipment bid will be.
That is correct.
And that there might be upwards to $1 million in temporary staffing to get through the implementation period.
Yes, ma'am.
And then the food costs is kind of an unknown because participation has not been completed yet, or the numbers are unknown at this point as we move into it. But you think it's going to be somewhere between $3 and $5 million based on what you've been told, right?
Yes, ma'am. I think the entire program, the $1 million for staffing, the $500,000 for the equipment, and $1.5 to $3 million for the food cost, based on about 30% participation, gets us to the $3 million to $5 million figure, and that's the money we have to find elsewhere in our budget.
In the budget.
Okay, so you're estimating a 30% participation in the program?
Yes, ma'am. That's just a real rough estimate. And why I say 30%, you're going to have people in and out of the program. You may not eat 3 meals a day. Particular days, an inmate could be sick, could be transferred to outside court. There's a variety of things. And to fully, if you wanted to say the $15 million figure, that means all 7,500 inmates would eat 3 meals a day, 365 days a year. We just know that's not going to happen. There's just too many variables. We have inmates that are on work squads.
What?
Work squads, where they actually, go outside the fence and provide a community service. Or any of the inmates that are eligible for this program on a work squad that wouldn't be around for lunch. There's just a lot of variables that we don't know at this time on participation. So I'm just trying to make I don't want to move too much money in and hurt another program. I would rather move an amount in that I feel comfortable with, and if I have to go get more, we'll go get more.
Okay, and the $500,000 for the equipment, was that based upon a 30% participation?
That was based on the number I was given of the equipment needs for the program. I don't know if they factored a participation into that. That was just something given to me, that figure.
So you don't know how that number was arrived at?
No, ma'am. It was equipment for each institution.
Okay, and the temporary staffing, somebody gave you that number, that's what they projected? Whoever they is projected?
Right. That is a staff member for each, not facility. You had quoted the 60, each compound, where we may have a main unit, an annex, and a work camp. You could have 3 in one compound. It's 1 per compound. It's 1 additional staff per compound to help with the implementation.
Okay,
that's how that was worked.
And was there any analysis as to what that additional person would do, or was it at this point just a real rough estimate that if you're going to have a new program, you need to task at least 1 person with overseeing and making sure that it is run at each institution?
I believe it was to deal with the testing, the monitoring of the program. I don't have a whole lot of information on that. I calculated based on 48 times about $20,000 a year to get to my $1 million figure.
Your Honor, if you will, there will be a witness that will have that information for you.
Great.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Do you consider 0.5% of your budget to be an insignificant amount?
There's nothing insignificant when you start the year $45 million in the hole. Every penny counts.
Okay. I have no further questions for Mr. Talent.
Okay. Any cross-examination of Mr. Talent?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. This is Mr. Mygat.
Correct.
Did I get it right this time?
Yes, Your Honor.
My court reporter will marvel at that.
Good morning, Mr. Talent.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Thank you.
The state has determined that it's going to implement the religious diet program, correct?
That's what I've been told. Yes.
And it's going to do so even with the state's present fiscal constraints?
Yes.
You don't have any reason to believe that the other states such as Texas, California, and New York, as well as the Bureau of Prisons, don't face similar budget constraints to the Florida Department of Corrections, do you?
I do not know.
You don't know whether they're also facing hiring freezes at this time?
I do not track them unless I'm asked to do something.
And you don't know whether or not they face overcrowding at all at this point?
I do not.
But you did testify that you're not even close to your early release numbers yet, right? You're only at 92 to 93% of your bed capacity?
Roughly, yes.
You don't know the participation rate at any other Department of Corrections, New York, Texas, California, in their kosher diet programs, do you?
No, sir.
You don't have any reason to think that the Florida's rate of prisoner participation in its religious diet program will be higher than Texas or California or New York?
I have no idea.
But you said that you knew that 7,500 prisoners would not likely participate in the Florida Department of Corrections program. Is that right?
That would be my personal assumption, yes.